Welcome, history fans, to Boise State University Online. Well, this is no news, I think, to anyone listening to this. We've been thrust into a whole new reality, courtesy of the coronavirus 19. I think the context for this is probably best stated by Alan Saunders, who proclaimed, "Life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans." I don't think any of us anticipated anything like this when we started the semester. But here we are. This is our new reality. So we're going to try to make the most of it as we go forward. Now, in our case, the most of it is going to relate to online learning. Some of you might already be well aware of the pros and cons of online learning. There's no one size fits all, and I'm not going to say that online learning is the optimum, because at the end of the day, people learn differently. Some folks prefer online, others prefer in person. But in our case, we've got no choice. We've been moved to the online learning world. So we're going to try to take advantage of more of the pros and try to mitigate or minimize some of the cons that we might encounter as we go forward. So what you can anticipate is Boise State will continue, of course, on a altered context, being online. Then specifically in our class, we're going to be continuing to do what we've started with, trying to find different ways in general, and then more specifically through history, how to take scattered information and create knowledge. So a few words as we wade into this new era. I think it's best encapsulated by this statement: keep calm and we'll learn online. Now, for our purposes, my recommendation is that you just focus on the next step in front of you. We still have several weeks of this course. We have more layers, different elements of assignments that we'll be developing. But we're going to try to do the best job that we can to stay in touch with you. And again, that entails, if you've got questions that come up, the single best way to stay in touch is via the email. And I'll be doing the best I can to also update Blackboard. So those are going to be our two key elements as we move forward with all of this. Now, for today, I just wanted to cover, after touching upon our new reality, just two elements, two key elements, as it happens, for the work that historians do. And what I wanted to lay out here is going to build upon what we've already had a chance to commence in class. So we're going to be continuing using the acronym, what's referred to as the CRAP test. And as you can see here on the screen, CRAP is just the acronym for the citation, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. We'll continue to use the CRAP test because it's one of the key ways that historians do history, because we have to figure out an analytical framework with which to engage our various sources. So I'll be pushing out on Blackboard more follow-up with the CRAP test, because if the CRAP tests are solid, substantial, papers come very close to writing themselves because you've got the substance going in. So you can anticipate as we go forward, we'll be continuing with the CRAP test as you develop your research project. But today, what I wanted to touch on is another key history tool, and we're going to refer to that now as text, context, and subtext. Now, this is a process, text, context, and subtext, that can be applied to various forms of content. What I want to build upon, I'll credit Bruce Lesh for developing this graphic. Here, he spells out the distinctions, what it is that we mean by text, context, and subtext. And again, since we're on video here, the beauty is you can just press pause if you want to take a bit more time to write down any of these elements, or even return and listen to the audio. But here succinctly, what we want to try to model today is what we're going to be asking you to do going forward. Specifically, we're going to be asking you to find a primary source that relates to your research topic. Primary source, by definition, is someone who experienced that event versus the secondary source, that's someone who will come later, got the information secondhand. Then you have the tertiary source, that's encyclopedias, etc. So we're going to be asking you to use this process, text, context, subtext, on a primary source that relates to your research project. I always try to provide the reason as to why we're asking you to do this. And if a picture is worth 1,000 words, as I've touched on before, this is one of the great scenes from the film of 1939, The Wizard of Oz. Now, if you can make out there towards the bottom right, that's the dog Toto. And what Toto is doing is pulling back the curtain that was drawn to hide a person, in this case, as we know, the person who was trying to pass himself off as the Wizard of Oz. Well, if you've seen the movie, and if not, well, here's the big reveal. He's not really a wizard. He's become quite proficient in bells and whistles. So one of the reasons that historians want to use text, context, and subtext is that we can go beyond just the words on the page or the picture on the screen. So what we're going to endeavor to do is now, using a few slides, is to model for you a few examples now of text, context, and subtext. Our first one, I'll use the text of Pablo Picasso's Guernica painting. You can see there on the screen, there's a condensed version. The actual painting itself is massive. It fills up a whole wall. Maybe it's maybe like 30 feet wide. So here we just have a portion of it. And in this example, I just wanted to use a painting just to make the larger point. It does not apply only to words that are written down. A text, for our purposes, as historians, could include, for example, this painting. It could be a photograph, etc. So in this case, we'll use Pablo Picasso's Guernica. The context now to understand where this this painting is situated is in the midst of the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s. And what sets aside this particular episode is it was the first recorded air raid in human history. And what's being pointed to here, what Picasso tried to capture on the canvas, was the attack of the Spanish nationalist forces on the Republican forces. Spain at this time is in the middle of a fierce civil war between the nationalist side that triggered a rebellion that wanted to overthrow the republic that had been elected. And then you had the side that was the republic and people who believed that it was the legitimate form of government. But this situation quickly broke down. Both sides picked up arms, and it was one of the bloodiest wars in all of Spain's history. It sets up what will soon follow with World War II, because the Spanish Civil War, as part of the context, included many of the isms. Fascism will be involved, and in this particular case, Nazism, because the planes that bombed the Basque town of Guernica, that Picasso would then commemorate in this painting, those planes came from the German Nazi Air Force. They were enlisted by the Spanish nationalists in their attempt to crush the Republic. So that's the context where Picasso's coming from this specific historical moment. Second point of the context, he was hired to paint, and without being given a specific topic, because of his reputation, he was hired to paint a piece for the Spanish pavilion for the upcoming World's Fair. So he wasn't really sure what he wanted to paint. And in the midst of this is when now that Basque town of Guernica was attacked by the German Air Force. And that's what he took as his moment of inspiration, to produce what many artists consider to be one of the top works of art of the 20th century. Now, as we move from those examples of context, there can be many more added to that. But to continue with this brief example, to go to the subtext now, what I think you can make out in the image is the presence of human agony here. There you can make out humans, and they are not finding themselves in a pleasant state. On that day, it would be Basques who would now try to flee, literally, death coming from the skies. It was a strategic attempt on the part of the Nazis to develop a new war technique. That was the context. But the subtext was Picasso's attempt to use this painting to convey the horrible elements that come with war. So that's an example of Picasso's Guernica of text, context, and subtext. Now I want to move to a second and final case study for text, context, and subtext. And for that, we'll now borrow from American history. And that's going to take us now to what is referred to as the Gettysburg Address as our next example of text, context, and subtext. All right, so to briefly now identify the text and some of the particulars around it, you can see the text there on the screen. It is a very brief speech that was later published, that was given by Abraham Lincoln in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on November 19, 1863. And as we go forward, you can also see on the screen, I put the little yellow circle around the image there of Abraham Lincoln. It's the only image we address. Well, let's provide now just elements of the text as well as the context as we go forward. The text itself is very straightforward. The task of the historian now is to take what we see here on the screen, the actual Gettysburg Address, and now provide the context and subtext that comes with it. So for some of the context, this address was given in the midst of the American Civil War. The American Civil War remains America's bloodiest war. More Americans died in the American Civil War than all other wars combined. And it was in the midst of the Civil War and in the aftermath of the single largest battle. The Battle of Gettysburg, a few months earlier in July of 1863, was the largest single battle of the American Civil War. And as we can anticipate in this largest of battles of the Civil War, it also produced an incredible number of casualties. On that day, thousands of soldiers, whether they were dressed in the blue of the Union or the variation of the color gray for the Confederate forces, thousands fell dead on the battlefield. Now, in the context of the aftermath of the war, there was a temporary, short-term attempt to provide some form of dignified burial for those who were left dead on the battlefield. But the initial attempts in these shallow graves proved insufficient. It's somewhat harsh, but unfortunately, critters, various animals in the area would move the soil away to reveal the humans who had been buried there. So quickly, people understood that this temporary arrangement was not going to work. Something more permanent had to be established. So what was set in motion was an attempt to create a formal burial place for those who died in the midst of this battle. And today, it's some of the most hallowed ground in the United States. It's one of our more impressive national parks in Gettysburg. And as you can make out here on the slide, the context of the Gettysburg Address was Abraham Lincoln giving this speech to dedicate this new cemetery. Now, for the context of this, Abraham Lincoln was actually an afterthought. He was not the keynote speaker that day. He was sent an invitation if he was interested to provide a few appropriate words. But Lincoln well knew that he was not being invited to be the keynote speaker. So he easily, had he wished, could have begged off and said, "I'm sorry. I'm sure you can understand in the midst of the Civil War, I may not be able to attend this ceremony, etc., etc." But Lincoln believed he had to go. He had to go to Gettysburg because he needed to know. He needed to know if he could achieve his subtext. So let's now look at the text, how it gives us a hint now of the subtext. Embedded in the speech are these three examples of unqualified or unexplained elements. So the first one you can see on the screen, he makes a reference how he was here to dedicate this tribute to this unfinished work. Just a bit later, he comes at it from a slightly different angle as he speaks about now the great task remaining. Until finally, he makes a reference now to why it is that we persevere, and that is for a new birth of freedom. Now, nowhere in the text specifically are any of these three elements you see on the screen defined. So that's now the work of the historian. We've gone from the text itself that we can see on the screen. We know the context, when it was given in the midst of the American Civil War. And I've given you a hint now as to the subtext. Lincoln believed he had to give this speech because he had to find out, could he achieve his unspoken objective? What was his unspoken objective? The big reveal: abolition. Unfinished work, or the great task remaining, a new birth of freedom. What all of these mean in a word is abolition. But never once is the word abolition in the text of the Gettysburg Address. So this is where, as a historian, you make these types of distinctions. The text, refer back, if you will, to that earlier slide. Okay, that's on the surface. That's what we all see. The second job of the historian then is to move to context, to place that text in the context of the American Civil War, the pivotal battle. Okay? But it's the subtext that now looms large. So let's provide some context to appreciate the subtext of what Lincoln was trying to accomplish. Lincoln was anticipating what was soon to come, the presidential election of 1864. As he was going into this election, he was very well aware that the American Civil War was very unpopular. There were folks, of course, who were opposed to the war in the South because of the hardship and the carnage. There were many people in the North as well that were opposed to continuing the war. So by Lincoln signaling the unfinished work, the great task remaining, the new birth of freedom, what Lincoln was advocating was that the North continue the war. So as he went into the presidential election, it was very clear to Northern voters where Lincoln stood on what was one of the key elements of that presidential election of 1864, and that was to continue the war. Now, I just mentioned the Northern voters real quick on context. The South note at this time, because of the Civil War, they are not participating in the presidential election of 1864 because they have proclaimed that they have seceded. They have left the United States. So they don't want to be participating in anything that has to do with the federal government of the United States. So Southern voters are not a part of that election of 1864. So his challenger on the Democratic side was the former Union General George McClellan. that you can see here in the graphic. And he was nominated by the Democrats to oppose the Republicans. And McClellan and the Democratic position was peace now. What that meant is that when people went to vote in November of 1864, they had a very clear choice on the issue: will the North continue the unfinished work? Will the North continue the great task remaining? Will there be a new birth of freedom? What do all three of those mean for our subtext? Will the North continue to fight to abolish slavery? That was the clear choice for voters in the presidential election of 1864. On your screen, now you have the results. I don't want to oversimplify this election of 1864, but I do want to underscore one of the central elements was just that. Will the North continue? See, because the Democratic Party had made it very clear that if you voted for McClellan as president, then the Democrats would seek to negotiate a peace settlement with the South, which in practical terms meant that the Civil War would come to a rapid end. Versus if you voted for Lincoln, then who knows how long the unfinished work is going to take. Exactly how much of a task is yet remaining. And you made it very clear, do we continue to fight to abolish slavery? But the results tell their own story. The majority of voters in the North, and note who we are addressing here. Again, it is just white Northerners and not white Southerners. White Southerners are not voting in the election of 1864. The majority of white Northerners, by voting for Lincoln, made it very clear that the American Civil War would continue. And it would continue for almost 2 more years, until finally, in 1865, there was a formal surrender by Confederate forces to the Union. But this would bring about, finally, the end of the military activity of the American Civil War. But between the election of 1864 and the signing of this peace, thousands more yet perished. But it was not all for naught. What was left unspoken in the Gettysburg Address was made very clear when the 13th Amendment was now proposed. So quickly, for some context on this, the Constitution of the United States allows for the process of amendment. And it was the 13th Amendment that you can see here on the screen that was pushed forward to finally now abolish slavery in the United States of America. This was finally the law of the land. You can see also the graphic on the right. Following the American Civil War, the reconstituted state of Georgia also voted to ratify the 13th Amendment. And when Georgia voted to ratify, that provided the required 3/4 of the states. And this now became the law of the land. Note that in the Gettysburg Address, abolition is nowhere stated explicitly, but that was the subtext, the significance, therefore, of what was being argued. So this is, therefore, just one, actually 2 examples that I've tried to provide you of how historians use text, context, and subtext. I'll leave this video online so you can reference it later, but you can anticipate as we go forward, we're going to be asking you to do this, what historians do, to a primary source that relates to your research topic. All right, so that'll be on the horizon, and I'll be pushing out on Blackboard the scaffolding for this as we go forward. So again, we want to stay calm, and we're going to be able to find ways to continue to learn online as we do history. But one parting note before I leave you is just a quick word on a misunderstanding, confusion that's out there when it comes to history. So I wanted to approach it with this notion of history as rhyme. All right, so with that in mind, we've been using in this course the acronym R. A standing, as you can see from the graphic, for assertion, R for the reasoning, and finally E for the evidence or an example of what is being presented. Now, as the coffee mug proclaims, everyone is entitled to my opinion. Fine. Anyone can assert anything. But we shouldn't be expected to accept assertions unless we have an opportunity to analyze the reasoning and the evidence. All right, so now let's put this in practice. Let's explore this initial assertion. History repeats itself. I think a good many of us have heard this used, bandied about. All right, so that's our first assertion. History repeats itself. Now, I wanted to contrast that with a second assertion. This second assertion is attributed to Mark Twain. History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. All right, so we've got two assertions that are making conflicting truth claims. So which one is true? Does history repeat itself, or does it rhyme? So who should we believe in this scenario? Historians are not at a loss. Because of tools such as assertion, reasoning, and evidence, we can begin to try to discern, okay, which of these conflicting claims actually comes closer to greater truth. Okay? Now, let's take the first one, the notion of history repeats itself. All right, and explore now some of the reasoning and the evidence behind this. Now, if it were accurate that history repeats itself, then logically what would follow is we can predict the future. See, are you following the logic here? If history repeats itself, well, we know what happened before, so we know what's going to happen, therefore, tomorrow. Okay? Now, I think most of us understand, well, we're living it now. It was only a few weeks ago. We didn't even imagine this coronavirus 19 situation. Okay? We can't predict the future. And in the context of the coronavirus, we're not exactly sure how long this is going to last. Will it be a few weeks? Is it going to be several months? We don't know. So we don't have that level of certainty in history that it repeats itself. A second example to explore, if you will, the reasoning and the evidence to examine history repeats itself. Well, in the case of the two greatest calamities of the 20th century, World War I and World War II, in terms of the carnage that was produced by these two world wars, we at least did the courtesy of giving each its own number. Now, there were many things that were shared in common from World War I to World War II, but World War II does not repeat everything that happened in World War I. Folks who have studied this can attest to this. So we don't have that kind of direct repetition. Now, what I've alluded to is this shared element. So between World War I and World War II, there are these shared elements. And we should expect to see this. And I believe that the statement that history repeats itself actually emanates from an attempt to try to make sense of why is it do we keep seeing some of these things again and again and again? Now, what is the constant or common denominator is human nature. That's why we keep seeing these things that seem to repeat themselves, but never repeat themselves exactly. Because if it exactly repeated itself, then we would know the future. So here we have on the slide, the world has changed, but humans will always be humans. In the other small graphic there, you have an image there of a caveman in blue jeans. And what it's referencing is, bottom line, though humanity has undergone profound transformation over the centuries, in some fundamental ways, though, we stay basically the same with fears, our hopes, jealousy, envy. These remain constant in human affairs. So we shouldn't be surprised when these things seemingly reappear. That's one of the big jobs of the historian, is to find those patterns, or to use Mark Twain's reference point, is to find the rhymes. Now, note, when you rhyme, it's not identical, right? That's the whole thing of, well, roses are red, violets are blue. I like history. How about you? Well, when you rhyme, you can't use the same word again. See, that you can't repeat. So when we make a reference, therefore, as historians trying to find those rhymes, what we're trying to find, therefore, are these patterns to help us make sense of what has gone on before. So again, to use evidence, history does not repeat itself. If it repeated itself, we would know the future. And if it repeated itself, as you can see on the screen, we would have the equivalent of the periodic table, because those elements always repeat themselves. We don't have that kind of certainty in history. We can't be certain what the future holds. So to conclude with this point of history as rhyme, there's greater or more truth in what Mark Twain was said to have proclaimed, that history repeats itself, because it's those human patterns that recur that we as historians are trying to make sense of. And that's a key part of what it means to learn from history. But we want to differentiate between history rhyming and history repeating itself. History does not repeat itself. So to repeat myself, we don't have the periodic table. Okay. So to conclude, as we go forward, we'll remain in touch via email. I'll be pushing out updates on Blackboard. All right, so do on a regular basis come back and always check your email as we go forward. Though we have this disruption and we're having to move everything online, we can do this. We'll find the best way to work around these challenges, and we're going to continue to do history as we go forward. So thanks for checking in and taking in this video. I hope these examples of text, context, and subtext will better inform what we're going to be asking you to do as we go forward, as you develop your research project. And also, secondly, always keep in mind what we as historians are trying to find, why we do what we do, to find those rhymes in history. Thanks for your attention.